There's something many Africans don't know, a secret hidden behind fancy economic terms and diplomatic smiles. The truth is, Africa has been scammed, and not by a single person or some underground criminal network, but by two powerful Western-led institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. For decades, these two giants have drained Africa's wealth, stifled its growth, and chained entire nations to debt, all while presenting themselves as saviors. But how did they manage to pull off a scam that has lasted for generations? And more importantly, what is Africa doing now to break free from their grip? In October last year, a different kind of gathering took place in Marrakech, Morocco. While the World Bank and IMF were busy hosting their grand annual meetings, just steps away, another group was assembling, the Global People's Tribunal on the World Bank and IMF. Their mission was simple but explosive: to listen to the voices of communities who've suffered under the weight of World Bank and IMF policies. People came from across the global south, from Ecuador and Egypt to Indonesia, Ivory Coast, Kenya, Malawi, Mexico, Pakistan, South Africa, Uganda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. The jury wasn't made up of politicians in suits, but of experts in economics, human rights, and social justice. People determined to seek the truth, and what came out of that tribunal was shocking. Testimonies revealed a dark reality, that these institutions, created to help struggling nations, may actually be bleeding them dry. So, what exactly did these testimonies uncover? One after another, representatives stepped forward, sharing powerful stories and hard facts. They exposed how the policies pushed by the World Bank and IMF and carried out by governments have left deep scars on their nations. They painted a vivid picture of a system rigged in favor of wealthy, developed countries, while developing and poorer nations pay the price. Projects funded by these global institutions weren't lifting people out of poverty. Instead, they were often violating human rights, displacing communities, harming livelihoods, and silencing local voices. People spoke of lives torn apart by crushing national debts and brutal austerity measures. Schools and hospitals stripped of funding, fuel and agricultural subsidies slashed, families left to battle soaring prices and survive a relentless cost of living crisis on their own. And perhaps most chilling of all, the testimonies revealed a truth few dare to say out loud: that the IMF, far from being a neutral helper, often acts as a debt collector for the world's richest creditors and lenders, ensuring that the poor stay poor and the wealthy keep getting wealthier. At that tribunal in Marrakech, the testimonies got even more personal and even more damning. Representatives shared real-life examples of people and entire communities devastated by the policies of the World Bank and IMF. They laid bare the cruel contrast. While ordinary citizens were sinking under poverty and debt, a tiny group of the richest individuals in their countries were reaping massive profits from those very same policies. The stories were so shocking, so undeniable, that it left the room with only one conclusion: the World Bank and IMF might just be the biggest scam of the century. But what exactly does that mean? The biggest scam of the century? To answer that, we have to go back, all the way to the beginning. It all started in the ashes of World War II. Europe was in ruins. Cities were bombed out shells. Food and fuel were scarce. Financial systems had collapsed. Things were so desperate that, in Germany, people started using cigarettes as money. Yes, cigarettes instead of cash. That's how bad it was. Terrified that such chaos could give rise to communism or spark new violence, Western leaders knew they had to act. So, in 1944, representatives from 44 nations gathered in a small town called Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. Their mission was ambitious: to rebuild shattered economies, create a global monetary system that could prevent another worldwide depression, and, hopefully, keep the peace for generations to come. The outcome of that historic meeting in Bretton Woods was the birth of two powerful institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. At first, the World Bank had a clear mission: to help rebuild Europe's shattered cities and economies by providing crucial loans for long-term development. The IMF, meanwhile, was created to keep watch over the world's monetary system, ensuring stability and preventing another global financial collapse. Over time, the World Bank's mission grew. Today, it claims to focus on reducing extreme poverty around the world by offering loans and development programs. The IMF's purpose, at least on paper, has stayed the same, protecting global financial stability. But here's the part many people don't realize. When those 44 countries sat down to build the foundations of the World Bank and IMF, not a single seat at the table belonged to Africa. Every one of those countries was European or Western. Back then, Africa was still carved up into colonies, and its nations were only beginning to fight for independence. So, when these powerful financial institutions were created, no African voice was heard. No African leader signed the agreements, and every rule, every policy, every clause was written to serve Western interests first. And that simple fact still echoes through history, shaping who holds power and who pays the price. Yet despite having no voice in how these institutions were built, African nations today are still forced to follow the rules and demands of the World Bank and the IMF, rules that tilt heavily in favor of the West. And here's where it gets truly shocking. The entire system has been rigged so that African countries remain trapped at the bottom. Take this, for example. When African nations borrow money from the World Bank or IMF, they're charged higher interest rates than European countries borrowing from the very same institutions. Think about that for a moment. How can it make sense that a developing country, already struggling with poverty and weak economies, has to pay more interest than a wealthy nation that's economically stable? It doesn't. In fact, it's downright sinister, because those high interest rates mean African countries pour huge chunks of their budgets into paying back loans and interest. And sometimes, they're forced to take out new loans, just to pay off old ones. Imagine that, borrowing money to pay back the same lender. It's a vicious cycle that keeps Africa chained to debt. The truth is, the World Bank and IMF may wear the mask of helping hands, but underneath, their policies are colonial in nature, designed to keep Africa dependent on the West. The World Bank claims its mission is to reduce extreme poverty worldwide, but in reality, it's the very policies and conditions they impose that have helped make Africa the poorest continent on Earth. And that is no accident. Decades of research have exposed a hard truth. The economic model pushed by the IMF and the World Bank is built to protect the rich and leave the poor behind. At the heart of this model is something called neoliberalism, a system embraced by many Western economies. It sounds technical, but its impacts are painfully real. Neoliberal policies/public services push essential services into private hands and shift the tax burden away from the wealthy and onto ordinary people. In Africa, this has been nothing short of devastating. Hospitals and schools starved of funding, the cost of living climbing higher and higher, basic services like water, electricity, and healthcare becoming privileges instead of rights. And through it all, African governments are told to prioritize one thing above all else: paying back debts, even when it means sacrificing the rights and welfare of their own people. That's why so many African nations are drowning in debt, forced to borrow more and more, just to keep the financial wolves at bay. It's a cycle designed not to lift Africa up, but to keep it exactly where it is. The bias of the World Bank and IMF in favor of Western interests goes far deeper than just policies or loans. It's baked right into how these institutions are run and who gets to call the shots. From the very beginning, there was an unspoken deal. The leaders of these institutions wouldn't be elected by the world, they'd be appointed by the West. By tradition, the president of the World Bank has always been American. The head of the IMF has always come from Europe. And that's no coincidence. Because when it comes time to make decisions, the balance of power is massively tilted toward the wealthy nations. The United States, for example, holds so much voting power that it effectively has a veto over any major decision. Alongside the rest of the G7 and the European Union, these wealthy nations control well over half the votes in both the World Bank and the IMF. Meanwhile, middle and low-income countries, like those in Africa, are left with just a fraction of the voice, barely enough to make a ripple. The reality is stark. African nations have almost no say in decisions that shape the global economy. Whatever the US and major European powers decide becomes the law of the financial world. And here's the hard question. Do we really believe the West would approve policies designed to lift Africa up and make it independent? The answer is a resounding no. If you didn't already know, here's a brutal truth. The The West wants an Africa that stays dependent, because a dependent Africa means the West keeps its leverage and its centuries-long hold on Africa's wealth. That's why, for the past 40 years, the West has used the World Bank and IMF as tools to impose harsh economic programs across countries in the global South. They're called structural adjustment programs. Sounds harmless, right? But they're anything but. These programs are the price African nations have to pay just to access loans. They come with strict conditions: mass privatization of public services, brutal austerity measures, and forced market liberalization. For European multinational corporations, these policies opened up a goldmine of profits. But for Africa, they were a disaster. In the 1980s and 1990s, just when many African nations were struggling to stand on their own after gaining independence, these programs choked their economies. Incomes fell, poverty exploded, entire nations were plunged into years of recession and stagnation, and the pain didn't stop there. Even today, the legacy of these so-called structural adjustment programs poisons every corner of African societies. They've kept the continent from catching up with the rest of the world, widening the gap between Africa and nations that once claimed to be its partners. And that gap is no accident. And so, it's no wonder that the Tribunal in Marrakech found the World Bank and the IMF guilty, branding them the biggest scam of the century. Because behind all the fancy speeches about ending poverty and creating prosperity, the truth is far uglier. For decades, these institutions have been scamming African nations under the comforting disguise of development. They advise governments to slash spending on essential services, schools, hospitals, clean water, and push for privatization that locks poor people out of basic rights. They shift the tax burden off the rich and onto the everyday person by lowering income taxes for the wealthy, while hiking regressive taxes like VAT that hit the poor the hardest. Even worse, the economic model they promote is deeply flawed and sexist. It's a system that overwhelmingly benefits a privileged, wealthy few, most of them men, while leaving millions of women and the poor to struggle in silence. If nothing changes, Africa risks remaining forever chained to Western interests, with no real hope of freedom or self-determination. But here's the spark of hope. In recent times, African countries have begun to speak up, boldly calling out the injustice baked into the global financial system. The calls for reform are growing louder. At the recent 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, African nations stood united, demanding an overhaul of the global financial architecture. They want a system that reflects today's realities and the risks that African nations face, not the interests of the past. Because the truth is clear, Africa is done waiting for permission to be free. At that same conference, African delegates didn't mince words. They laid out urgent priorities: debt relief, fair access to concessional finance, climate funding, and ways to unlock private capital for real development. For Africa, this is not a theoretical discussion. It's a matter of survival, transformation, and sovereignty over our development trajectory, declared Claver Gatet, UN Undersecretary General and Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. His words carried the weight of a continent tired of waiting for change. But talk alone isn't enough, and some African nations are beginning to take matters into their own hands. In a bold shift, they're turning away from Western financial institutions and looking to non-Western partners for support. This isn't happening in a vacuum. The world itself is undergoing a massive transformation, and at the heart of it is a direct challenge to the West's grip on the global order. Russia and China are leading that charge, joined by countries across the global South. Together, they're sending a message: enough is enough. The days of Western dominance, especially in Africa, are numbered, and it's not hard to see why Africa has become the center of this struggle. The continent matters enormously for 4 powerful reasons. First, Africa forms the largest regional bloc at the United Nations, commanding around 28% of all votes in the General Assembly. That's a political force no one can ignore. Second, Africa holds vast mineral wealth, including rare minerals found nowhere else on Earth. A treasure trove essential for everything from smartphones to electric cars. Third, its geography is strategic, with crucial sea trade routes flowing through East Africa, connecting global commerce from Asia to Europe. And finally, Africa is home to the world's fastest growing youth population. By 2030, About 42% of the entire global youth demographic will be African, a young, energetic force that could shape the future of the world. So it's no mystery why every major power wants to forge strong ties with Africa. Whoever wins Africa's trust could very well shape the next century. And now, some African nations are seizing the moment, turning their backs on the West and forging new alliances with non-Western powers, especially China. Over the past 2 decades, China has swept across the African continent with massive investments in infrastructure. Roads carve new paths through jungles and deserts. Railways snake across borders. Ports rise along bustling coastlines. All told, China has poured more than $140 billion into these projects, reshaping entire economies. One highway, one bridge, one railway at a time. By 2020, around 49 African countries had signed onto China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, tying their futures to Beijing's vision of global connectivity. And the trade numbers tell an even bigger story. In 2000, China-Africa trade stood at just $11.67 billion. But by 2022, that figure had skyrocketed to a staggering $257.67 billion. China is now the biggest single trading partner for many African nations, eclipsing traditional Western partners and redrawing the economic map of the continent. The message is clear. Africa is no longer willing to wait for Western promises. It's charting its own course. And China is right there, ready to build the road ahead. China's growing footprint in Africa hasn't gone unnoticed, and it's sparked fierce criticism from the West. Western critics accuse China of playing a dangerous game called debt trap diplomacy. They claim that China dishes out massive loans for flashy infrastructure projects, loans that many African nations simply can't afford to repay. And once the debts pile up, China can swoop in, taking strategic control of critical resources or assets. Zambia and Uganda are often held up as cautionary tales. Take Zambia, for example. The country owes China around $5 billion, nearly 30% of its foreign debt and roughly 20% of its entire GDP. But there's another side to this story. Supporters of China's involvement in Africa argue that Chinese investment has delivered real, tangible benefits: roads, ports, railways, and digital networks that the West talked about for decades but rarely built. They point to projects like the railway connecting Nairobi to Mombasa in Kenya, which has boosted trade, created jobs, and sparked local businesses into life. Still, critics keep warning that all these shiny new projects come at a hidden cost, long-term economic risks, and a troubling lack of transparency in Chinese loan agreements. They fear that the fine print could be exploitative, undermining the sovereignty and financial stability of African nations. But here's the question that cuts to the heart of it all. How is that any different from what the Western-controlled World Bank and IMF have been doing for decades? If we look at the record, there are far more documented cases of the IMF and World Bank undermining the sovereignty and stability of African nations than there are involving China. Some argue that, when you strip away the headlines, the China-Africa loan agreements look far more like partnerships, deals based on mutual benefit, than the exploitative, one-sided deals Africans have suffered under Western lenders. And while the West might grumble and criticize, the truth is, there's not much they can do to stop this shift. Africa is charting a new course and the old powers are being left behind. So, what do you think? Is China a savior or just another player in the same old game? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget, like, subscribe, and share this video.